shortly. There'll be another networking break in about an hour. So if you can make your way to the seats, really much appreciated. All right, hello everyone. Hello, welcome to Canary Live Boston. All right. We have an incredible crowd here tonight. Sold out show. Our second sold out Canary Live. We did one in Boston 6 months ago. Or I'm sorry, in New York. We're in Boston tonight. 6 months ago that sold out, so we appreciate the support. I'm Nicholas Rinaldi, General Manager at Canary. And like I say, we're thrilled to be here with our partners from Canary Media and our host, Greentown Labs. Thank you to Jill and Kelly and the team for hosting us. We wouldn't be able to do it here tonight. So let's, round of applause for Greentown. So not only is this a special day because it's our Canary Lab Boston, which is very close to our heart, but it's also Canary's birthday. We started 2 years ago today. And, you know, we set out with ambitious goals. We wanted to be the newsroom of record to cover solutions to the climate crisis, cover the energy transition. We have a great team of reporters. You'll be hearing from one of them tonight, Maria Virginia Olano. So we're celebrating our birthday, and if you got our newsletter this morning, well, first off, if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, like, come on, right? canarymedia.com, please subscribe. But if you got the newsletter, you saw we're kicking off our spring donation drive. We are a nonprofit newsroom. We rely partly on the donations of our readers and our friends and those who support us to fuel our newsroom and help us thrive. So you'll notice throughout the space tonight, we have some QR codes here on the right side, by the bar, at the entrance. If you scan those, it will take you to the donation page. Anything that you can give to show your support, to signal that this type of journalism is important to you, means a lot to us, and it helps us ramp up our coverage of everything from IRA implementation to environmental justice in frontline communities that are dealing with fossil fuels. So please keep that in mind, and we'd appreciate your support if you can. Before we get started tonight, well, we have a great lineup. Back on the stage, maybe after a few years, I don't know, but Steve and Lacey will be up first with the carbon copy panel, and you'll be hearing from Steven in a minute. We'll then go into networking break, and we will have our second Canary panel moderated by Maria Virginia Olano with a really esteemed set of journalists joining that panel. So before we start, I do want to recognize our sponsors as well tonight, because without them, this would not have happened. Nexamp, you'll be hearing from Keith from Nexamp shortly. I know there's a lot of Nexamp folks in the house tonight. I thought I heard a couple shout outs in the back. There we go. Sense, thank you very much. Boston Metal, Mass CEC, and Greentown, obviously. So without further ado, we'll kick off the night, and I'll invite Steven to the stage.
Ooh. Hey everybody, thanks for taking the time. I don't know how to reduce, there we go, thank you. We are so grateful that everyone came out, took time out of their evening to come watch the show and watch these panels. before we actually start the entertainment, I wanted to give you a little overview of the run of show, talk a little bit about what we're doing with the podcast and Postscript Media and our partnership with Canary Media. And then I'll bring Keith from Nexamp on to say a few words, and then we will begin the show. So we are going to be recording these sessions tonight. The opening session of Carbon Copy is it's a live recorded podcast, so you all are doing a wonderful job being nice and quiet. And we know that people want to network and talk to each other. So if you do maybe want to talk to someone, try to find a corner. But we would appreciate it if you tried not to talk during the shows, because these mics will pick up chatter. And we very much encourage you to interact with the shows. So if you hear something that you like, feel free to cheer. If you hear something you don't like, feel free to jeer. And we just want to hear from you as part of the crowd. And we will be taking some listener questions as well. So if you've got something creative or interesting to say, please feel free to step up. We'll take a few questions. And then please keep those questions short as well. So a little bit about Postscript Media before we get started. We're a production team. We are a team of 10 producers making shows at the intersection of climate change and other areas: news, business, culture, tech, food, supply chains, fashion. And we are thinking about how to tell the climate story for people who are moving money, making decisions, building companies, starting their careers, in all these different areas where we can tell the climate sustainability story. And so our philosophy is that you can make this a hopeful, inspiring story by telling solutions at these areas where people are making decisions. And so that is the spirit with which we are building the audio programming. And we're pleased to partner with Canary Media as well. We produced 2 of the shows in partnership with them, and we have a great relationship. So we're just really grateful that you're all here. We're super excited to start the show. And I'm going to bring Keith from Nexamp up to say a few words, and then we will get the party started.
5 or so professionals who are passionately pursuing the decarbonization of the U.S. and our energy grid through our projects that include things like community solar, energy storage, a number of decarbonization solutions that we're working on and rolling out. We have a portfolio of about almost a gigawatt of operational or nearing completion assets, generating assets right now, another couple of gigawatts in the pipeline. So we're making good progress, but we're just honored to be here to be sponsoring this event tonight, and grateful to Canary Media and Greentown Labs. We just feel like it's really important that as an industry and as a society, we have these conversations about the issues that we're facing and the challenges that we're facing, and bring together some of the smartest people to discuss the options and opportunities to address those. And so events like this, here in Boston, everybody thinks of Boston certainly as a healthcare leader and a tech leader, but I think we're rapidly becoming a clean energy leader as well. And so Boston is a great place to host one of these conversations. What's happening tonight aligns very well with Nexamp's mission, and I speak for everybody on the team when I say that we're just really glad to be a part of this market. We're confident that the progress that we and our peers are making a difference in the world. And so we envision a future where the clean energy economy is a job driver, is an equity driver, and really just takes into account all of the needs of the communities where we operate. And so for Nexamp, equity is a core part of our mission, both in our customer base and in our employment. We're also happy to say that we're going to be opening an office next week, actually, up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Another 70 or so jobs up there. Our National Operations Center is going to be located up in Lawrence. And so we chose Lawrence as one of the Commonwealth's gateway cities intentionally to provide some much-needed employment opportunities up there. So with all that, again, we're just grateful for you all being here tonight, paying attention to what has to be said, and we're happy to be able to be part of enabling these important conversations, hoping that we can make some progress. So on behalf of NextAmp, welcome and thank you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen and ask the panelists to make their way to the stage for the podcast. Have a good evening.
So it's a little hard to tell these days. I don't know if I'm in an AI-created simulation. Are there human beings in this room? Can you make yourselves audible? Excellent. So normally when I'm doing a live show like this, I sit down and think really carefully and use my editorial expertise to craft a narrative intro that's going to hook you all in and make you feel the importance of the issue that we're talking about. But today, I'm going to do a little high wire act. And I have not written anything. And I'm going to use our friend ChatGPT-4 to help me write an introduction to the show. So I've got some prompts here, and we'll see if we can use an AI voice generator and ChatGPT to help introduce the show. So ChatGPT tends to respond to flattery, so we'll start there. You're Stephen Lacey, an extraordinarily talented energy podcaster who hosts a podcast called Carbon Copy. You're currently recording a live episode in front of a large audience at Greentown Labs in Somerville, Massachusetts. The episode is about artificial intelligence and digital climate solutions. You're speaking with Priya Donti, an AI expert, MIT assistant professor and executive director of Climate Change AI, Amy Francetic, managing general partner at the venture capital firm Buoyant Ventures, and Jesse Morris, an energy expert and CEO of the Energy Web Foundation. Can you please write a dramatic and intelligent introduction for the podcast that outlines the stakes for using artificial intelligence to clean up the energy system in the style of a trailer for a thriller movie? Let's see what it gives me. Okay. Now I'm going to dump it into my AI voice generator here. Here we go.
In a world where climate change threatens the very existence of life as we know it, 3 experts have come together to explore the power of artificial intelligence to save our planet. The Carbon Copy takes you on a thrilling journey through the frontiers of AI and climate solutions, featuring the brilliant minds of Priya Donti, Amy Francetic, and Jesse Morris. As the fate of the planet hangs in the balance, these trailblazers will share their insights and innovations, illuminating the path towards a sustainable future. Will their ideas be enough to avert disaster and create a better world for future generations? Join us for an electrifying episode of the Carbon Copy as we delve deep into the heart of the AI revolution and its potential to save the world. Get ready for a blockbuster podcast event that will leave you inspired and energized to take on the greatest challenge of our time.
That's pretty good. Maybe a little too aggressive, so maybe we can do something a little lighter in the style of a romantic comedy. Absolutely, it says. Okay, here comes the script. Okay, it takes a second. All right.
Welcome to the Carbon Copy, the podcast that brings you the latest energy and climate news with a twist. Today's episode is all about love, the love story between artificial intelligence and the energy system. Meet our charming AI lead, who has the potential to optimize energy systems and minimize waste. Our expert panel, featuring Priya Donti, Amy Francetic, and Jesse Morris, will help guide our hero through the ups and downs of a complicated relationship. But can AI win over the hearts of the energy industry and overcome the obstacles in their path, such as job displacement and privacy concerns? Will they find their happily ever after and create a sustainable future together? Join us for a romantic comedy that will leave you swooning and rooting for our unlikely duo. This is The Carbon Copy, and love is in the air. Are you ready to fall in love with the future of energy? Let's find out.
Pretty good.
I like that one. That was good.
Pretty good.
That was good.
Very impressive. I tried a couple prompts before this. Those were some new prompts, and I'm very impressed. What do y'all think?
I think you still have a job.
This is where we need a big gap here.
It's getting harder and harder to operate with this. I think in 6 months we'll see who's taking over the hosting job here. So, look, I will provide a little bit of framing here for this conversation because we are in a pretty different world now, and then I want to get some thoughts from my panelists up here who are going to help frame this issue. First of all, you guys have all been playing with ChatGPT 4. Have you anybody come up with any creative energy prompts?
I asked it to create a joke for me.
Oh.
A climate joke for scientists. And here it is.
Okay.
Why don't scientists trust atoms?
Why?
Because they make up everything, including climate change.
You know, I was going to bring a list of dad jokes, but that tops it off. All right, so I haven't outsourced my critical thinking skills to ChatGPT 4 yet, but I'm going to set the stage a little bit of my own interpretation of what's happening here, and then we'll get the conversation underway. So up until about 6 months ago, if you'd ask people in the energy business or in climate tech about the hottest areas of tech innovation, artificial intelligence might have topped the list for some people, but probably wouldn't have gotten into the top 5 for a lot of people. And that's not a reflection of the capabilities or even stuff that's playing out in the field. It's mostly a reflection of our personal experience. And suddenly this Cambrian explosion of large language models led by ChatGPT has suddenly hooked in hundreds of millions of users, offered mind-boggling creative capabilities that have surprised almost everyone, kicked off an AI arms race in the tech world, and forced us to grapple with the very real prospect of artificial general intelligence in the not-so-distant future. I mean, we're all really starting to grapple with what that would look and sound and feel like. So today's conversation is, to some extent, a reflection of that radical shift in the public discourse, but it's about a lot more than that because there's so much more happening beyond generative AI in the energy space today. And, you know, we're going to touch on how it's being used today. And we're also going to broaden beyond AI and talk about the digital layer that is necessary for decarbonizing and decentralizing the energy system. So in this conversation, we're going to kind of get beyond the gold rush mentality, and we're going to talk about practical use cases, and then talk about what is coming next. So you heard GPT introduce the panelists. Let's bring them back in. Priya, for years, you've been focused on machine learning as a helpful tool for climate solutions. Talk about the moment today. Like, what is different? All of a sudden, everyone is talking about it. How would you characterize the sudden interest in the space?
Yeah, so I'd say that machine learning has really, in and of itself, accelerated over the last several years, last decade. And this has been due to a combination of kind of widespread data availability, increased computational power, and also improvements in algorithms. And then, of course, in parallel, the climate conversation has accelerated a lot. And I actually attribute a lot of that to improvements in attribution science, right? When we were able to really start saying this specific event is due to climate change, I think that really kind of galvanized the public conversation. But as Stephen mentioned, kind of, over the last, for a long time, people didn't put these things together. And so I think many trends came together, but one thing was that my organization, Climate Change AI, we wrote this paper called Tackling Climate Change with Machine Learning, where we kind of sat down, really looked at the literature and really surveyed stakeholders over, several months, and really tried to understand where is it that AI and machine learning can play a role. And we saw a lot of different kinds of use cases, including kind of turning raw data into actionable insights, so taking satellite imagery and turning it into insights about where the solar panels are, or taking sensor data and using it to automatically optimize heating and cooling systems in buildings, or learning from past experiments on how to synthesize batteries and then using that to actually suggest what kinds of batteries could be synthesized next. And of course, we weren't the only ones to observe these use cases. I would say that this conversation, really started as we saw this kind of interest in climate change and addressing climate change and the kind of advances in machine learning really coming up around the same time. And I think that years later, there's now, of course, much more interest in the space, much more investment, and I think much more urgency to really be galvanizing all the tools we have in our toolkit to address what is one of the most pressing issues of our time.
You getting a lot more phone calls?
Yeah,
So I want to talk about the different categories of artificial intelligence. But Amy, let's go to you. So Buoyant was founded to invest in a lot of different kinds of companies in the digital climate tech space across energy, industry, agriculture, circular economy. How do you define that category, and where does AI fit into that?
Sure. So I like to say that I've been in the climate space long before it was fashionable, and Buoyant has been investing in digital climate from our very beginning. That was our entire focus. And we're looking for digital technologies that we define as software, including AI, and simple hardware. So we're not investing in the hard tech, like a lot of the great things that are happening here at Greentown Labs. We're investing in simple sensors that are collecting unique data that the software can use to do a lot of the things that Priya just described. And I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. Stephen, when he called me and told me he was doing this, I don't think you even finished the description of what it was. And I just said, yes. I didn't even look at my calendar. I'm like, I have to be here for this conversation because our firm was really built to do this, and you had these amazing other folks involved, and we've been reading a lot of Priya's team. Climate Change AI has done a wonderful job of researching in this space and writing about it and citing, which has been fantastic. So just building on all that momentum and now seeing how much attention AI is getting, we actually have a number of companies that are using AI, and one of whom is here, housed in Greentown Labs. And it was our very first investment. It's a company called Raptor Maps. It was, It was co-founded by two MIT grads that met at school, Nikhil and Eddie, and they're using AI in a lot of different ways. Namely, they're taking footage from drones, which are robots, a type of AI, that are flying over large solar systems, solar assets, and collecting data, and they use machine learning and computer vision to distill that data into useful insights that the managers and owners and operators of that equipment use to get a little bit better production out of the equipment. And this is really important because they've invested in this very expensive asset, and if it degrades or loses a few percentage points of production, that's very costly to them. So the insights that Raptor Maps is producing, not only from the analysis of the drone footage, but now they have a full stack software solution that they're using to build a digital twin of the asset and predict production based upon information that they're gathering from all kinds of assets. So back to this idea that they're gathering large sums of data from assets around the world and using that to predict behavior on a single asset is really, really powerful. And making a solar farm produce 2 or 3% better solar production is very, very meaningful, and we saw that as a really critical part of making solar an incredible solution towards climate change. So we're really thrilled to be working with this company, and they've been doing great, and we're built on AI from the very beginning.
So how often are you saying no to a pitch, and then that person puts on a fake mustache, slaps AI on their pitch deck, and suddenly repitches you? Are you seeing a lot of bad pitches with AI suddenly infused?
You know what? We were seeing a lot of that in the Web3 space. Okay, so when
that tracks.
Web3,
that tracks.
Okay,
yeah.
That's right. So Jesse's going to talk about this, and when that was before the crash of crypto, I know that AI is here to stay. Okay, and it's so fundamentally groundbreaking, and we're sitting here in one of the birthplaces of AI. I mean, Priya's going to go be a professor at MIT, where Marvin Minsky, like, you know, really was one of the godfathers of the whole practice. So I know it's here to stay. I know that Web3 is here to stay, but we saw a lot of pitches that were really artificially trying to use tokens or use crypto or use blockchain in some way that was not core to their function. And I look at I hope we can see through that at Buoyant. Like, and most of the companies that are pitching us, they're pitching a solution. They're not pitching, we have AI. They're saying, like Raptor Maps, we're gonna help you get a better return on your investment in solar assets. We have another company called Real Data. We're gonna help you get better production out of your land-based aquaculture. That's the pitch.
Yeah.
That's the pitch. And so AI is a tool.
Jesse, you are an energy expert, formerly at RMI. You came to the blockchain Web3 space. So tell us, characterize what's happening in the Web3 space right now. I think a lot of people are sort of curious about how it's playing out and what kinds of projects you're working on.
Definitely. So before I answer that, Stephen, I just want to second Amy's comment. Thank you so much for convening this, because I'd actually maybe make this conversation maybe not as important as the trailers that you played, but pretty important. From my opinion, if we don't, and the language I use about this, deploy digital infrastructure across all of these different sectors of the economy to help accelerate action against climate change, we will fail. We will not address climate change in a time frame meaningfully to our lives and the global economy. So this layer of digital infrastructure, of which AI is a key part, thank you so much for hosting a conversation about it, because it is critical. So look, on the Web3 and crypto of it all, yeah, I mean, it's been a heck of a ride. I'll put it that way. Our organization, it's called Energy Web Foundation, spun out of Rocky Mountain Institute. We were focused on building open source solutions to help energy market participants basically deploy digital infrastructure and solve problems like Amy was talking about. We've found a few specific ways to use Web3 technology that are useful. It's not a panacea. And in fact, if I look back, I was just looking at my calendar before I got on stage. Back in 2017, I was at an event on the other side of Boston. It was an energy blockchain conference. I gave a presentation where I said, hey, everybody, we've found 200 different companies out there that are energy blockchain companies, and they have all of these different use cases, yeah? And I was excited, I was on stage, I was shilling, you know, everybody get excited, this is awesome, right? How many of those companies are left today? There's 200.
5.
3. 3, right? And of those, did any of them get acquired? No, right? So I offer that anecdote to say there is real value, and we'll probably get into it later on this panel, in terms of the ways that you can use Web3 technologies to support some of these problems energy companies are facing. But for me, it's just been a journey of learning on that side. Whereas with AI, and I'm not an AI expert by any means, the fact that we can reach out and touch it, the fact that you're having companies pitch you and lead not with the technology, but with a problem they can overcome, that right there in and of itself is progress and gets me really excited. So we can talk more about Web3, but long story short, from my perspective, a lot of cool stuff out there, also a lot of not so cool stuff that is quite a bit of marketing driven hype around a certain technology, but there are companies using it in really interesting, innovative ways to solve real business problems. It's just when you hear about billionaires and their net worth plummeting 99% in 2 weeks who are running cryptocurrency exchanges, it's kind of hard to look away from that and actually see some of the value being created.
So Priya, given that, how do we start to separate some of the froth from the real applications? Like a few years ago, you wrote a pretty seminal research paper on the use cases for machine learning and climate solutions. And you know, a lot has changed in the last few years, but I'm sure that there are a lot of companies sort of hyping this up as well. So like, how do you think about where the real use cases are? What kind of new and emerging and interesting use cases are you seeing? And do you see any froth, you know, companies that are maybe just potentially just using the words AI, artificial intelligence, and don't actually have a good solution?
Yeah, so I'd say there are a lot of, you know, really exciting use cases out there. So I mentioned some earlier, this idea of, you know, creating better forecasts for power system operators. For example, the nonprofit Open Climate Fix, they used AI and machine learning in combination, with satellite imagery, historical data, to cut the error of the forecast that National Grid, the UK power system operator, is creating by a third to a half. And this is really improving the way in which power system operators are actually operating their grids. You also see many use cases of, again, scientific discovery, which is an example I gave earlier. So, for example, the startup Aionics is using AI to actually analyze when I am, trying to synthesize a battery for energy or for transport or for something else. These are going to have different properties from each other. And I can only synthesize so many batteries. So can I somehow learn from the success or failures of my past experiments in order to better understand both what battery I should try to synthesize next that might be more successful, or whether there's a part of the search space that I should learn more about in order to then inform my future experiments. So there are lots of use cases like this. I would say that kind of if you can get past a couple of key questions, right? So what is the actual problem that's being solved, right? Fundamental, not sort of what technology is solving it, but what is the fundamental problem that's being solved? I think as the others mentioned, this is a key aspect. But then why AI, right? Why not an alternative? What's something that could go wrong? Are there biases? Are there, negative consequences that could be exacerbated? I think really asking those questions and really exploring the alternatives space can give a lot of clarity on why is it that you're pursuing AI in a particular place. And in some sense, I think equipped with that knowledge, if people are really coming into it in a way that's really informed by the actual potential and the actual limitations of the technology and are really evaluating it from that lens rather than getting swept up by the hype, I'm not actually as worried about that aspect. What I am more worried about is companies that are maybe were not initially climate driven and are using AI as a mechanism to kind of bring themselves back into the cycle and sort of repitch themselves as a climate change plus AI company. For example, some companies that were, canonically trying to optimize oil and gas assets just, to make oil and gas companies more money, not necessarily. There are ways you can kind of work in that space in ways that are nuanced and move us towards climate goals, but that wasn't their angle. And now see the opportunity to say, oh, well, we were doing something with data, so now we're AI driven and we're also doing climate stuff. And they have the kind of industry experience and expertise and the ability to really sell the answers to those questions that I just mentioned, but where they're coming in with different motivations. So I think that's actually really what I'm most worried about, AI being used for greenwashing in this very particular way.
Let me add one thing adding to that, like not only that they're solving a problem that matters, but they're solving a problem that somebody will pay for. That's a really critical piece for a startup company. It's wonderful if you can do something very novel that's really, really interesting, but is that a consulting business or is that a nonprofit? Is it really a solution that is very financially meaningful to by them buying your solution, it's going to improve their profitability, it's going to save them enormous amount of money, it's going to streamline something very complicated or make safe something very unsafe in their business. Those are the kinds of things that somebody will pay for. And we have a company called Real Data that is using AI to help fish farmers that are producing fish in land-based aquaculture reduce the cost of fish feed and improve the growth of the fish so that they can produce more fish. And this is really important from a climate standpoint because we've overfished the oceans, and I know that's a very potent reality here in New England, and a lot of the fishermen here in New England are experiencing this. And then the way we grow fish in the ocean now off the coast is very environmentally damaging. So we're going to have to find new ways to produce fish to feed the world, and it's an amazing source of food and protein for so many people. And so if you can reduce the cost of food for the folks that are producing the fish, if you can help them figure out how to help those fish grow faster, then you can get enormous amount of profitability by using AI. And this company is using this with cameras and machine learning to analyze this and help the fish producers.
I think the business piece is another, again, to juxtapose AI and potentially what's happening now with Web3 and crypto. In my experience, there were very few Web3 or crypto companies that were selling a solution to enterprises. to solve a specific problem. There was a lot of development and activity and really cool technology being built, but it's typically one set of innovators building innovative technology for the other group. This is where a lot of the experimentation in like decentralized finance and stuff is happening. But there are very few instances of a big business saying, that's cool, I'm gonna write a check to buy your product, right? So one of the cool things that I'm now seeing with AI is that there are companies that will write those checks. I mean, for example, I almost feel like I'm late to that AI party. Before this panel, one of the solutions that we've brought to life with a number of different electric utilities in Australia, one of the partners to that solution was constructing digital twins of the distribution network because, shocker, distribution utilities sometimes don't even know where transformers and overhead lines are. They don't even have a map of that. And then second, constructing something called operating envelopes for those. So an operating envelope basically looks at every single endpoint on a distribution network and then basically says, hey, every 5 minutes, here is how much power you can export or how much you can take off of the grid in order to maintain it, which is a far better way of running distribution networks instead of saying, I have a new solar system, oh, now the utility's telling me I need to wait for 3 months to put it on my roof. So there are companies that I didn't even know they were using AI to construct those digital twins, to construct those operating envelopes, and they're being used in a production environment today, and utilities are writing checks for them.
One thing I'll jump in though, I think, is that I agree about this, like, will somebody use it? And in the context of for-profit, a startup, will somebody buy it? Is, I think, the correct like instantiation of that, or am I able to make the solution sustainable from an organizational sustainability perspective, from a scale perspective? But I will say that I think that if we kind of also should be bringing in these kinds of solutions and technologies in public interest applications in cases where it may not make sense, right, for a for-profit entity to be the one taking forward a particular idea, where there may be a use case for an independent entity, a nonprofit, a government, somebody else to take that forward. And an example there is, for example, this coalition of organizations called Climate Trace, which uses AI on-the-ground sensor data, satellite imagery to provide an independent inventory of greenhouse gas emissions from different kind of emitting, but not just at the country level, but at the asset level around the world. And the reason they're doing this is because there are so many entities that have, entrenched interests or reasons that they don't want this emissions inventory to actually be accurate, right? So as, for example, governmental entities are negotiating emissions-related agreements at the UN Climate Change Conference. If an emissions inventory estimate would make them look bad, they don't necessarily want that out there. If a specific entity wants to be able to underreport or cheat on their emissions, they don't want an independent estimate out there. And if they're, that is a setting where maybe having that kind of independent, objective, public interest bent, it's not necessarily that anybody is paying for that. Like, a lot of people hate that it exists in some sense, but it's something really important to move the conversation forward. So I agree, thinking it just about who is the user and how do I make this sustainable so that I'm not just, creating something that then never scales, never has a use case down the line is, I think, kind of the core underlying thing there.
Can we talk about the large language models for a moment? They can be used for novelties, like we saw this evening, but they can be used for powerful things like anything from establishing a communication strategy or the foundation of a communication strategy to actually coding. So what should companies in this space be thinking about the potential for integrating large language models into their business processes, or potentially using it to help create the foundation of new products?
The connective tissue between the solutions and the customer is one great place to do this. So if you've got a piece of software and it has to integrate with somebody's ERP system, like an SAP or an Oracle system, how do you connect those? And that's a great use of software building tools related to ChatGPT. Or, like, I'm really interested what Bloomberg is going to do. They just announced they have this ChatGPT version that they're going to start to integrate into their solution on their terminals to try to analyze and disclose and reveal kind of to what you said. Of course, they're going to ask people to pay for it, right? Because it's Bloomberg. It's going to cost you $25,000 a year for a subscription. But they want this to be able to identify risk that people have in their investment portfolio.
So instead of factoring in the whole internet, they're just factoring in all their financial data.
Exactly. So they're going to look at climate risk and climate data, this massive trove of weather and climate data that we have that now says that asset is at risk for flood, that asset is at risk for wildfire. And then they can also marry that with all of the financial information and the reports that corporations must produce as part of their reporting to their investors, and they can perform that level of analysis, and that's what they're aiming to do. This is what they're saying they're aiming to do, is to be able to then say this company has this risk. And we saw this very much when we were looking at, we did some foundational research on climate risk intelligence that kind of helped establish our fund and one of the things we were looking at. And we talked to customers, a lot of customers who had risk. And we knew these disclosures and this regulation was coming because we could see what was happening in Europe, and we could see that this pressure that was being placed globally on big investors to try to disclose this was gaining momentum in the US, even though right now we have this backlash and a lot of folks are trying to say, oh no, ESG is bad and woke. Like, it's coming, it's still coming. But the thing that we heard from the customers is they didn't want to just be told about the risk. They wanted a solution. It wasn't good enough to say, ring the alarm bells, you have a problem. Just to your point, that's maybe hard to deal with. Okay, now they need a solution. So we started looking, instead of looking at all the companies that were measuring and disclosing risk, we started looking for solutions. And we invested in a company that has a parametric flood insurance solution called Flood Flash, because they were presenting a financial solution to that risk. So I think you kind of, thinking about what people will pay for, I thought that they will pay for that. If somebody rings the alarm bells and Bloomberg starts to say this, or one of your nonprofits discloses this, or First Street Foundation, which is an amazing trove of data that has used hydrology data and climate data to describe flood risk around the world. You can put your address in, and it's like really powerful. And that's a nonprofit. But again, like, what do you do with that risk? Now you have to take some action. And that's where I think some of these solutions where startups can be very, very important.
I really hope that these large language models help incumbent energy companies. If we kind of truncate climate and just talk about the grid for a moment, because electrification and decarbonizing the grid is one of the biggest pillars of energy transition more generally. I really hope the large language models will help individual people who are maybe not digital natives to really just to de-risk some of this stuff, right? I mean, right now, if you work in an information technology at a transmission system operator in Europe or an independent system operator in the US or a distribution utility, typically those departments have been somewhat underfunded. They're not attracting a lot of different talent. There aren't reams of software engineers sitting within most of our electric utilities. So if some of the digital solutions being offered to utilities right now, whether it's, hey, we can construct a digital twin for you, or hey, we can construct a solution for you to make it possible for you to interact with distributed energy resources on your system. If the pitch was, okay, now we have to do a 6-month IT project, a deep integration with your existing systems, we got to train all your staff to use it, honestly, it's going to be kind of painful. And it says, actually, we have some text to software models that make it much easier for your people to configure a solution and deploy it. That would be transformative, just to make it easier for some of these solutions to be deployed. We're trying that now. I was on the line with my CTO the other day, and we are now making a tool so that some of our customers, which are these electric utilities, can use chatbots to configure software that lets them communicate with DER and procure services from them. Just use a chatbot to say, I want to spin up a demand response program to procure services of these qualities and these characteristics. Here's how we're thinking about configuring the compensation mechanism. Here are some other toggles. So, I mean, we haven't figured it out yet. It's going to take us as a product organization a while to figure it out. But if large language models can make it easier for incumbents to adopt these digital technologies, that would be a huge win.
How about the interconnection queue? To your point, Jesse, if they could figure out how to speed up the wait list for all of the wind and solar projects that are waiting to be evaluated by all the RSOs. I mean, that we need this. We need them to kind of speed it up.
I mean, if we want to talk about problems facing the energy transition right now, that's huge. There's a report out today. It was one of the national labs, I believe, published it. 2 terawatts of backlogs, solar, wind, hydro, batteries in interconnection backlogs. 2 terawatts. And I think that's just transmission level. We're not even talking about distribution stuff, which people tend to ignore. That's insane. So how can all of these different tools come together to help unblock that, to transform the way that we interconnect renewables? These are the kinds of solutions that I hope we see in the next couple of years.
That would be game-changing.
Maybe stepping back though to maybe, I think a lot of those solutions sound really, really important and really cool, but as maybe thinking back to this barometer to evaluate whether an application kind of makes sense, I think a lot of these make sense because they satisfy this key property, which is something that is hard to do, but easy to verify. So ChatGPT and other generative models, what they're really doing is kind of learning some big probability distribution over text or over images in the case of image models, and they're drawing from it. And so what that means is that there isn't necessarily kind of truth inherent in that or accuracy inherent in that, and people who have played with these models will have seen, right? There are lots of inaccuracies, there are lots of challenges with these outputs, and this is a fundamental challenge in the models. These models don't know how confident they are in an answer, how likely it is to be correct. And so in a use case where it's really hard to create something, and you want to save a lot of time, but you know on the other side whether it is correct, then that's great, right? I want to, generate an intro to a podcast and I kind of get a sense of whether it's good or not. You can do that, right? I want to use this to generate new climate legislation. Oh, you're probably going to have to pay a lawyer to look at it anyway. They're probably going to have to fix a lot with it. Maybe you didn't actually save time rather than maybe just getting the lawyer to do it in the first place. So this is kind of, I think, a really important model. Is it, again, saving, is it helping kind of cut down the creation process in settings where you can understand whether the output is actually correct and where it doesn't, in some sense, cost you more time than it would have to just do the thing yourself at that point?
As I have watched this space unfold, outside of the climate space, I think most people in the tech industry have been pretty astonished, from what I can tell, at just how good these large language models are, just how good ChatGPT is, and it's kicked off extraordinarily fast arms race, a primarily commercial-driven arms race in AI, largely in generative AI, but it's raising a lot of questions within companies about what kind of capabilities they need to have to understand this space, potentially use these tools, build these tools. Does this reshape the way both startups and legacy companies have to think about building talent inside organizations?
Yeah, your job isn't going to be lost to AI. It's going to be lost to someone who knows how to use AI, right? So you're going to have to get proficient at this, right? And I think the appeal to me as someone who's been working in this space but is not a software engineer is that, not that I'm going to suddenly become an amazing software engineer, but that I'm going to be empowered to do things that otherwise I would have had to pay somebody who's really expert at this to do. It's going to give me some capabilities that I didn't have, and I think that's very true for our companies, where today at a lot of our companies, a data scientist is one of the plum jobs, right? We have, most of our companies are trying to take enormous amounts of data and drive something useful from it, and the big industrial customers are drowning in data. So all these machines are collecting all this data from all the sensors, and they have access to this, and they just don't know what to do with it. That's a theme throughout all of our industries, across energy, transportation, agriculture, the built environment. They're just drowning in data. So someone that can help them make sense of that is really, really valuable. And I don't think you have to be a PhD to be really good at that. I think you can graduate with some basic understanding of this and start to be really expert at the tools. And maybe you can do what a PhD was doing before because you're learning how to manipulate some of these tools. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, 100% agreed with that. And I think the other thing that's happening is because there's a lot more excitement around AI that's coming because of these tools, now all of a sudden other kinds of AI applications like the ones we've talked about are also kind of knocking on organizations' doors. And so this question of how do you, as an organization, even if you're not an AI expert, how do you understand whether a use case is reasonable? If you're trying to operationalize AI within your organization, what kinds of people do you need, right? A data engineer is different than a data scientist and so forth. And so I think getting that literacy at a leadership level in terms of just what is AI, what kinds of changes may it create in my organization, and what kinds of skills and personnel and structures within the organization do I actually need in order to both operationalize it and really responsibly understand what it might do into the organization, I think is an additional important
The data engineering is really key, Priya, because all these models are only as good as the quality of the data that they are using. If the data is garbage, the solutions are garbage. If the data is biased, the solutions are biased. So that like cleansing the data and bringing some real credibility and efficacy to the data is really, really critical. And that's going to be a very, very, very specialized role for sure.
And that's where, to me, so I'm pro using AI for the energy transition. It's awesome to hear both of you talk about it because you're so much closer to some of these solutions than I am. The only thing I get a little bit of a twitch about is like, you just said it, Amy. Let's step back. We actually have a data management problem in a big section of the climate crisis right now on the grid side. And you're probably coming through in this conversation, I'm a distributed energy resource geek. So if you want to talk batteries, heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar, like I'm your guy. And if you look at all of those assets, so all of these small scale assets, those are really going to be the future of how we balance the grid in the next 10 years. They're going to account for anywhere between like 30 and 50% of total system capacity. I mean, huge volumes of numbers of flexible load that can inject power, use power at different times. I live in California. I'm one of those customers. I have an electric vehicle, we have a heat pump, we have solar system. My utility has no idea I have those assets. They don't have the ability to collect data on them, let alone run some AI-based algorithm on them. So I think if we're talking about like digital literacy and AI literacy, I think it's also important to just recognize how analog a lot of our energy systems are right now, and we need to solve that problem in addition to, okay, now let's layer some intelligence on top of it.
Right. So we absolutely have to have a very strong digital layer in order to push forward the energy transition, but as you described, there are a lot of real physical limitations associated with grid modeling, grid controls, utility business models, sales cycles for integrating software, integrating new technologies. So like this is a very slow process, and for many of the people in this room, they're probably often beating their head against the wall at how slow it can be. So with that in mind, and given how fast a lot of these technologies are accelerating, what is something that you think will astonish us in the coming years, and what are maybe some of the physical limitations that you think potentially could hold these technologies back? Priya, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I'm excited to be astonished by is the capability of AI and machine learning algorithms to enable kind of automatic optimization and control of electric power grids. I think that once we set up the correct infrastructure to enable that kind of thing, this is going to accelerate really quickly. And so this is things like controlling distributed devices on the power grid based on local sensor data, or speeding up centralized optimization algorithms like unit commitment, security constrained optimal power flow, the boring stuff nobody really talks about, in ways that enable us to actually more dynamically optimize power grids. I think simultaneously there is something really critical holding that back, which is that there aren't really good pathways to deployment for a lot of techniques, AI, machine learning, or otherwise, that are actually interacting with critical operations and critical functions on a power grid. And this is because we have historically not allowed for huge innovation on power grid optimization because we're worried about the power grid blacking out. And so really thinking about how do you create the correct simulators, test beds, metrics that are really agreed upon by practitioners, by the industry, and really create these pathways to deployment, as well as the kind of physical and digital infrastructure that are needed to test and evaluate and really understand what that pathway for deploying AI and machine learning looks like, is going to be really critical. So I think if we can get that in place, I think we'll just be astonished by the extent to which AI and machine learning really enable us to manage these distributed renewable grids, but simultaneously there's a big bottleneck that I think should be a huge priority to clear, which is establishing these pathways to deployment.
Amy?
Well, I was trying to think of something. What would be astonishing? You set a very high bar. I mean, I'm astonished.
The jokes are going to get a lot better.
Okay, I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. I am astonished every day by the entrepreneurs that come and pitch us ideas, and they're incredible and creative and inventive. But I'm thinking like, wow, what would blow my mind, And so I think one of the areas is all of this satellite data that we have right now, that a lot of companies like Planet and others and Elon Musk have been, I think, trying to figure out, how to monetize it and what to do with it. But I think that applied to so many different applications, especially in the field that I care about, which is climate, and thinking about it, what can we track with all of this data in the oceans, can we get underwater and track what's going on under the ocean? We don't know much about how the ocean, we're seeing the effects on the coral reef and other things, but like the ocean is this enormous resource. It's most of, the Earth. How can we use satellite data to do something really incredible that could give us some kind of great leap forward in relation to climate? I think I'm sort of astonished. There was a company we talked to that I really liked and we didn't invest in because we are generally bearish about the carbon markets. But I think this is a really important area to get right, and where the satellite data and all the imagery can really show that all this money that's being spent on carbon reductions is not enough, it's not working, it's not going to advance the solutions fast enough, and we're running out of time. And I think, to your point of exposure, I think that could be very powerful. If we could get some better truth around that, and we're starting to see some of this crumbling now, people are starting to expose it, but that, I think, is really important because we don't have time to goof it up. We cannot wait a decade to mess this up, you guys. We have to get it right today. And we can't just sit around while the big emitters are going to spend $1 trillion on carbon offsets to allow them time to keep polluting. Like this, that can't happen. So maybe this ground source of truth that could come from the sky, from all the data that's being collected, could have some really important, truth-telling. And I think that would blow my mind.
I think one of the reasons it's a little bit tricky for me, at least, to talk about being astonished is because these large language models and the image creators and the DJ creators and stuff, it's so tangible. Everyone in this room can go on a computer and use it. A lot of the solutions, although not the one you just described, Amy, a lot of these solutions you just don't really see for the energy sector. It's kind of behind the scenes. And if you're an energy geek, you'd be jumping up and down. Oh my God, we just created a digital twin for an entire country's distribution network. Yes! Who does that matter to, right? So you got to be kind of a hardcore energy geek for some of these things to be astonishing. I would say, you asked also, Stephen, I think what's going to slow it down? Institutional friction. For a lot of these solutions, you've got to convince, not all of them, I mean, Climate Trace is an awesome example where we can just do that. We can take this top-down snapshot of climate emitters from around the world. But a lot of the business use cases, we've got to just do the hard work of, to the grindstone, convincing executives in organizations that are resistant to change, that are some of the most regulated entities in the world, to adopt new things. That's hard, right? Regardless if you're talking about AI, even if it solves problems for them. So I think just institutional friction is going to be the thing that slows it down, just like with any other innovative technology.
Also, the people that have the most to lose, like these big emitters, like you guys, they're not sitting down. And we're seeing it come out right now with what some of the Republican states are doing to push back on the SEC disclosures. We're seeing, the whole goofy narrative around the SVB crisis. Believe me, they're not doing everything that we want them to do right now. So and they have a major role to play, so they're going to be a big impediment.
Definitely.
Let's take some questions. I think we have time for a few questions. We've got a mic roving around, so we've got a hand up over there. Let's get a mic over to that gentleman. Can you keep your hand up so they know where to? Should I just use the mic up here? Or, okay, cool.
And while we're waiting for the mic, one quick thing I'll say is, before the show, I think Jesse and I were kind of joking around about, hey, I mean, some of the things that are needed here in order to enable these kinds of solutions, what's slowing things down, are super boring nitty-gritty, right? As you said, what can a utility actually, rate base and pay for? Is it software or is it just hardware? And so sometimes I think it's also the understanding of these really energy wonky rules and how they connect to that bigger picture and the next step of enabling digital technologies. And I think just getting the right set of people in the room who have that diversity of expertise to understand how these really wonky details really translate to deployment of digital technologies is really key.
So Peter Kelly, Bio Northbridge Energy Partners, you mentioned folks who don't want this to happen. I think about a worst case scenario where there are many state actors, persistent threat actors in cyber terms, that develop as many tools as they possibly can to attack civil society when the time comes. And artificial intelligence is a perfect vehicle for developing cyber attack strategies and deployment capabilities. How does one, in a world where we want to electrify and connect everything, avoid a situation where we put all our eggs in a basket that then gets completely destroyed by the same tool we're all hoping will save us, that somebody else is using and weaponizing to try and destroy our civil society that we hold so dear? How do you deal with that?
I can offer one perspective from my seat anyway. It's an awesome question, and I'll leave it to the AI experts to maybe take an AI tack to it. My response would be policymakers in the US should really consider injecting deep levels of decentralization into the way that we construct our information technology networks, right? If we have one central repository that has the smart meter information, just as one example, of every single smart meter in the US and all of the personally identifiable information with each one of those accounts, that's a security risk. It's very easy to come after that thing. There are ways to use decentralized technologies and architectures to make it much harder for malicious actors to come after the increasingly digital grid. So there's a really important role to play for decentralized information technology architectures to prevent any kind of attack, whether it's from AI or others. But I don't know, what do you guys think on the actual AI front?
I totally agree, and I think it falls under this broader principle of design things that are redundant, resilient, robust, right? Don't put all your eggs in the centralization basket to make this happen. The other thing I would say is there's a lot of really exciting work that is currently sitting in the research space, but I think is actually going to be really critical ultimately for deployment, that combines AI and machine learning methods, so data-driven methods, with knowledge from existing optimization, control, formal verification, kind of bodies of literature. And so really understanding how do you deploy an AI or machine learning system that has formal safety guarantees, verifiable guarantees, where we can really understand what some of these threat models might look like and how we actually design systems that are robust against these threat models is, I think, a really underrated area of work, but one that I think will be extremely critical for kind of creating these resilient systems.
But it's a real threat. I mean, it's a real threat, and we invested in my last fund at a company called Nozomi Networks that sells cybersecurity solutions for operational technology, and we saw what happened when there was a cyber attack on our gas infrastructure recently, last year. I mean, it can be hugely disruptive, right? And you mentioned the militarization or the weaponization of it. I mean, it can just cause just a lot of disruption to our normal course of life, not even doing something to hurt or kill people. So I think it's a real threat, and I think unfortunately the cyber people, as brilliant as they are, they're always sort of one step behind the criminals, right? Because they're learning and training their models off of the data and the problems that happen. So it is really a concern, and I think to the AI that is detecting the fakes too, right? We just have seen this, like you guys saw the Pope in his white puffer jacket, and the fake detector didn't detect it. So like the fake detectors will get better too. I think that we have to hope that there's as much energy and research and dollars that get put into security and privacy and defense related to it, not military defense, but defense of the security. That I think will be really, really important. We need that kind of investment as well.
Yeah, and I'd say it's important that those dollars are invested early. I think we've seen in a lot of other industries, when you build a system and invest in security as an afterthought, it doesn't work. You need security by design from the get-go. And so this is why also, as we've talked about, there's a ton of potential for AI to be used in climate action, a ton. And we need to run really fast in order to contend with the scale and just severity of the climate crisis. At the same time, right, as Amy said, we need to do it right. And so really understanding, sometimes fast progress doesn't mean the thing that looks the fastest in the moment, but it is sometimes that really careful, considered design of understanding what the security vulnerabilities might look like, what the biases might be, what the inequities might be, all of that kind of thing, and really building it into the design of the system in a really intentional way that allows this to scale properly going forward. Yeah.
It's a great question, and there is an astonishing array of potential threats in the energy sector alone, from consumer fraud all the way to threat to infrastructure. So definitely worth a very extended conversation. Anybody else have a question? Yes, right here.
Thank you all so much. My name is Lisa. I'm an undergraduate at Harvard. I founded the Harvard Undergraduate Clean Energy Group. Really excited about this talk of decarbonizing and optimizing our electric grid. But I'm curious how you think that we can approach communicating the importance and value of distributed energy resources. Jesse, as you described, there's a huge opportunity to optimize the use of heat pumps, control of water heaters to store thermal energy, as well as EV charging. But how do we kind of approach the privacy that consumers might be concerned about in giving grid operators or utilities control of their appliances?
I don't give them control. Could be one answer, right? So a lot of the programs that I have experience with is that the utilities aren't actually going to come into your house and wrest control of your device away from them. In fact, one of those solutions, it's an open source solution. Please take it out there, rip it off, send it, put it in more places. That's their whole mission. The architecture of it actually prevents that kind of behavior because the data is self-sovereign. So that means if you want to, you have to give very explicit permission to another market participant to control your heat pump or to control your battery. But what typically happens is a utility would send a price signal, and then either you or the device with an agent on it would decide, yeah, I'm going to keep it a degree higher today, and I'm going to get paid a couple bucks for doing so, right? But you nail a really good point, which is communication about this. Like, my mom actually lives in Massachusetts. She just got a bunch of heat pumps and like put solar on her house. She's like, okay, Jess, I want to do some cool stuff for the grid now. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you can't do that where you live, right? And so I don't know, that communicating this is a huge challenge. And I mean, even if there are all these demand response and transactive energy programs out there, how do we help consumers actually figure out how to enroll to them, understand the risks, the benefits? It's a huge challenge.
We have a company that does this with water heaters called Shifted Energy, and it is with their permission, and it's actually targeted at it's not just for, but it began as a solution for low and middle income consumers so that they could actually have their hot water ready when they need it, but they could have it heated when the prices are lower or when renewable energy was more available, and it started in Hawaii. And I think one of the biggest issues with rolling this out is incentives and rulemaking that will encourage this so that there is a financial incentive. And in this case, for these consumers in Hawaii, there is, because Hawaii Electric has a program to support that. But it's one example of, like, maybe your hot water, as long as it's available when you need it, is not such a risky thing. It's not making your house cold when it's really cold outside or making it too hot when it's really, really hot outside. Like, there may be applications where we can experiment that are less mission critical to people's livelihood.
I mean, it's, again, a very good question. And as I've sort of talked to so many companies in this space over the years, it's very obvious that this is not a technology problem. It is a culture problem. It's a regulatory problem. It's a business model challenge. And so, I mean, there are many extraordinary advancements to come, but so many of the solutions are available today and have been for a long time. Okay, so we are nearing the close here, and I had drafted up one last prompt here to have a little bit of fun to close out our show. So I'm asking ChatGPT here. I put this in already when we were talking. I want to play a game here to end the live episode. Can you please create a game called Real or Robot, tailored for each guest that creates a list of 2 fake items and 1 real item? For Priya, I want it to be a list of 2 fake research papers on AI and climate and 1 real one. For Amy, I want it to be 2 fake startups and 1 real one. And for Jesse, I want it to be 2 fake blockchain companies and 1 real one.
Oh, God. Oh, no.
Please make it a little silly so everyone thinks I'm funny. Okay, this is the result that we got back. Welcome to Real or Robot, where we try to fool the guests on stage. Priya Danti, are you ready?
Let's go.
Okay, this is the AI Climate Research Paper Edition. Number 1. This singing climate model, using AI to predict climate change through song. Number 2, robo-penguins for Arctic climate monitoring. Number 3, the climate-aware toaster, a machine learning approach to breakfast carbon footprints. Which is the real one?
Man, I wish all of those existed. I'm gonna go with ChatGPT hallucinated a bunch of papers.
I think you're probably right. We have to fact check this after, but it says the singing climate model using AI to predict climate change through song is the real one. I have no idea if that's real or not, but I think the hallucination problem is very real. Okay, Amy, Real or Robot, the AI Climate Startup Edition. Startup number 1, Vegan Bots, plant-based food delivery by robots. Electric Sparks, AI-powered EV charging networks. Or EcoPod, biodegradable coffee pods for a sustainable buzz.
Okay, I think the last one is the real one, and I think the first two are the fake ones.
No, the AI-powered EV charging network, Electric Sparks, is supposedly real. Again, we will fact check that. All right, Jesse Morris, Real or Robot, the AI Climate Blockchain Company Edition. Number 1, What's Up, the blockchain platform for sharing home solar energy. EcoCoin, the cryptocurrency for composting. The Crypto Climate Control Room, AI-powered climate management for your home.
Oh God, those all sounds like real pitches I've got.
Yeah.
Also, dude, I really want ChatGPT to be this startup naming service now. Yeah. Those are fantastic.
EcoWatt has got to be real.
There was EcoCoin or What's Up?
EcoCoin.
EcoCoin is fake according to ChatGPT. It's What's Up, the blockchain platform for sharing home solar energy. Invest in that coin. All right.
Don't.
So, I think we have come to a close. This has been a wonderful conversation. Let's please thank Priya and Amy and Jesse. And I have one final prompt that I put in. We need to close. ChatGPT, please write me a script closing the live show in the style of The Great Gatsby.
Ooh.
Let's see what we've got here. Paste it in.
Fading. And so the evening draws to a close, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation fading into the night. Lightened right to a close. So the evening draw.
Whoa!
Fading lightened us with their knowledge and expertise, shedding.
Let's try that again. Hold on, come on.
And so the evening draws to a close, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation fading into the night. Our guest and expertise shedding light on the powerful intersecting light on the power.
Hold on 1 second. I've overloaded the system. Let's try this one last time.
The blinking GPT light.
Yes.
And so the evening draws to a close, the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation fading into the night. Our guests have enlightened us with their knowledge and expertise, shedding light on the powerful intersection of AI and climate solutions. As the green light of progress shines ever brighter on the horizon, we are reminded of the words of a certain Mr. Fitzgerald. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the future. For the sake of our planet and its people, may we continue to forge ahead, guided by the insights and inspiration shared here tonight. And so we bid you farewell, with gratitude and hope for the journey ahead. Welcome to the...
Thanks, GPT. Thank you. Thank you again for being here. This was really fun, super enlightening. What an astonishing space to be paying attention to right now. We're going to take a quick networking break, and then we'll be on with the next panel. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All right, folks. All right, so this is being live streamed, and there are some folks watching it. So we want to create a little magic in the room. So before we go back live, we're going to just do a little practice here. So once we're live, I'm going to say, welcome back. And I'm hoping y'all will cheer a little bit just to like make people have a little FOMO, wish they were here tonight. So we'll just do a little practice, right? So, all right, welcome back. That's not bad. That's actually not bad. That's pretty good. Thank you. All right, I think we might be ready. All right, folks, welcome back. All right, we're going to transition into our last panel of the night, the headline panel, the journalist panel, uncensored panel, moderated by Maria Virginia Olano of Canary Media.
Hello, hello. It's so wonderful to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for making it out here and celebrating our second birthday with us. My name is Maria Virginia Olano, and I am with the editorial team at Canary Media. Thank you so much for reading us, for supporting us, for sharing our work. It's been a wonderful 2 years, and for many more to come. I am thrilled to be here with 3 esteemed local journalists who I'm sure need no introduction, but I am gonna give one anyway. We have Sabrina Shankman, she's with the Boston Globe. There we go. We have Miriam Wasser with WBUR. And we have Sam Mintz with RTO Insider. Okay, so we are meeting after what was the warmest January in all 6 New England states, and the 6th warmest January ever recorded in the country. We're also meeting a few weeks after another IPCC panel that once again put an alarming call for quick deployment of renewables and ramp down of fossil fuels. That report once again stoked in the region ideas to accelerate the transition to clean energy. It's a region that already has pretty ambitious climate goals comparatively, and so we are here to talk about that. How are we doing on the road to net zero by 2050 in Massachusetts? So yeah, let's start with that. Massachusetts has a new administration and some pretty lofty goals. How is this administration handling climate? We can start with you, Sabrina.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so the Baker administration, the most recent administration prior to this one, can count to its credit that there was some incredibly ambitious legislation that passed during that tenure. What the administration of Maura Healey has to do is actually turn that into action in a lot of ways. And, you know, it's been interesting. Obviously, she's just come in, you know, but the thing that she did on her first day was create a new climate chief position that's a cabinet level position that, you know, the Healey administration says is the only one of its kind in the country. And in speaking with her for a story that I did with Melissa Hoffer, the new climate chief, one of the things that I found really interesting was that she had actual things to do. Like it wasn't just a title that kind of had some vague authority, TBD, let's see how things go. It was like, okay, no, it's, you know, it's her job to be making sure that the state is applying for all the federal funds that are available to get as much for Massachusetts as possible from the landmark legislation that's passed. It's her job to be coordinating with all the different agencies to make sure that they all know what they're required to do under the existing legislation so they can actually reach those goals and then have some accountability. So, I mean, that's one example, but I think there's, you know, it remains to be seen, you know, how much is going to actually get accomplished. They are very ambitious goals. I think there are going to be more goals that continue to get rolled out by the Healey administration in the coming months to even step up what Massachusetts is aiming to do. But so far, it seems like they've hit the ground running at least.
Anything to add?
Sure. I would say that I think one thing that maybe separates this administration so far from the previous one is the intense focus on environmental justice. And not that the Baker administration didn't talk about that and try to center those things, but I think that you can really tell from everyone that's been appointed and the just different things that have happened so far that this is front and center, and that we are not just going to transition for some people in the state and not for others. So that, I think, also to their credit is great.
Yeah, and to me, the thing that stood out is watching the sort of personnel choices. You know, there's this slightly cliched saying that personnel is policy, which I do believe is true to a certain extent. So I've been interested in seeing what sort of new positions they've created. For example, a couple of new folks in an office focused specifically on regional energy and climate policy. I've hired a few people from the sort of NEPOL, ISO New England orbit. And then also, of course, we'll talk about the DPU later, I think, but I was really interested in seeing those hires and seeing sort of what those signal. Because, you know, we're all waiting for policy stuff to happen, and for the most part, it hasn't happened yet because it's too early. So the personnel has been interesting for me to watch.
Awesome. So let's get into some of those goals. A lot of this is riding on the build-out of clean energy, specifically offshore wind. Massachusetts will need 50 gigawatts of clean energy resources by 2050. A majority of that is going to be made up of offshore wind. It also has a storage target of 1,000 megawatt hours by 2025, which is just around the corner. So maybe starting off with offshore wind, Miriam, I know you've done a ton of reporting and you've been down at Barnstable. Can you tell us what is going on with the projects and are they on track?
Yeah, the offshore wind situation right now is very interesting, and Sam, feel free to chime in too, because I think you cover a little more, Sabrina as well. You can kind of say that there's like a tale of two industries happening right now. There's Vineyard Wind, which is that first 800 megawatt project, and that is on schedule. And right now they are laying transmission cables. I was down in Barnstable and saw, and it's really cool, these like giant cables coming under the ocean, and just the machinery it takes to lay them will blow your mind. But so Vineyard Wind is on track to start producing power by the end of this year. It should be fully up and running next year, and that's 800 megawatts, which is sizable. But some of the other projects that are coming down after are facing some very serious financial problems. Most notably, Avangrid's Commonwealth Wind project, which you haven't been following, is a great sort of nerdy, insidery story, but they signed some contracts with utilities, and then inflation is inflation, and they say it's no longer financially viable, so they tried to renegotiate and sort of ended up pulling out of their contracts. They want to rebid in the spring. So, I mean, I think to me what's interesting is that it's not the technology that is holding up the industry right now, it's the finances, and that feels like that requires a different set of remedies.
Yeah, I would add too, I mean, it's not just Avangrid, it's also the South Coast Wind
Yep.
project too, which, you know, they're
in other states.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. But what's interesting is, like, you've got that slowing things down on the one side. And then at the same time, you know, Massachusetts has historically been such a leader on offshore wind, but other states have caught up, right? Like New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, all over the eastern seaboard, there's this big buildup of offshore wind that's happening, and then you also have it happening globally, right? So we're slowing down, and so are other places in the U.S. too, but the U.S. also doesn't have a supply chain in-house, really. There is not the kind of manufacturing in the U.S. that there is in Europe. So at the same time that the U.S. is going to be coming out of this financial, you know, conundrum and hopefully figuring some things out, it's also going to be finding itself, I think, in a really interesting competitive place where all of a sudden there is this need for resources that, you know, are actually in Europe and are being claimed by European countries that are developing their offshore wind. And I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch over the next, 5-10 years.
Yeah, I would add too, there's another procurement coming up, another auction coming up this spring, and I think that will be, one, interesting to see who participates and what prices they're even able to offer, but this will be the first time that there's a procurement without something called the price cap. Prior to last summer, there was this policy in Massachusetts, or this rule in Massachusetts, that every subsequent wind project needed to produce cheaper and cheaper electricity. And you can understand why that happened at the beginning, because this was an industry that no one was really sure actually could work. But it's outlived its usefulness and was eliminated. Other states don't have it. So it'll be interesting to see what these companies offer in terms of economic development, in terms of manufacturing, and who bids at all, right? I mean, the economy is still not great.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out to me is that obviously this is not, at this point, brand new technology, and it's not, a brand new process of developing these projects, but that's still, it's unpredictable in that new things are coming up all the time, and it's hard to be, the first company doing it in a new place, especially. And I was thinking back to, I think it was last year, for the people who've really followed this, you'll probably know about the federal auction, a federal lease for a parcel of ocean off New York. I think it's called the BIGHT, B-I-G-H-T. And these just like astronomical numbers that these companies were bidding in order to, win access to these locations. And then you contrast that with these problems that the companies here are running into, where they're saying inflation is rampant and we can't pay for these projects. It happens so quickly, and it seems like a really, if I was a developer for one of these companies, I'd be really stressed all the time.
And of course, we can't talk about offshore wind without talking about transmission. And in the panel before, we heard about interconnection woes, and that is certainly true in the region as well. So I'm curious, how have you seen regional cooperation, or maybe lack thereof, on the transmission issue? Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to say to start, and I wrote down some numbers because there was this really good, Berkeley National Laboratory had a study that came out just today, actually, with some really great stats about interconnection, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is sort of the process by which grid operators and utilities sort of evaluate new projects and whether there's transmission upgrades that are needed to attach them to the grid. So first of all, it's taking a lot longer than it used to for the interconnection process to happen. It used to be 2 years back in 2008, 3 years in 2015, and for projects that came online in 2022, it took an average of 5 years from when they entered the interconnection queue to when they came on board. And these are almost all clean energy. In New England in particular, I think there are literally no fossil projects left in the interconnection queue. So it's a huge bottleneck, and something that, frankly, I haven't seen any grand, smart answers to. There's a lot of little regulatory tweaks going on, a lot of efforts, like you mentioned, regionally and federally to unlock more transmission access, but it's a really thorny problem that is not going away and is probably just going to get worse and harder.
Okay, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't talk about transmission right now without talking about what is happening on Monday in my home state of Maine, where there is kind of like the last hurrah of, is Maine actually going to allow the completion of a major transmission line through western Maine, bringing hydroelectric energy from Quebec to the New England grid. Now, this is a project, for people who aren't familiar with it, that has been in the works since around 2017, although the project developer told me he felt like it was more like 2012 when they really started trying to get it up and running. But the idea is, Massachusetts utilities have contracted 1,200 megawatts of hydroelectric energy from Hydro-Quebec. It is a cornerstone of how Massachusetts plans to reach its climate goals. And everything was going apace in terms of the permits and everything until a referendum in 2021 in which voters said they did not want it to go forward. It was this fascinating case where you had the state's largest conservation group, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, partnered up in essence with fossil fuel companies, many like big oil companies from Texas that did not want this project to go forward, and so they funded this incredibly expensive campaign to shut it down, and it worked. Now there is this question of, was it constitutional? Did the companies actually have the right to build this transmission line when they sunk like $430 million in the project? And so that's going to start going to get hashed out in a jury trial, of all things, starting Monday in Maine. So you're going to have a jury, which is like a very strange thing, right? You've got a jury of 9 individuals who will be deciding the fate of one of the most consequential energy projects in the region. So that is like, for me, one of the most interesting things going on right now, and so crucial, because that issue of how do you get electricity from northern New England to southern New England is this really crucial question that has to get answered, because you're not going to be building out utility scale solar and onshore wind in Massachusetts and where you've got all these people. It's going to be up there, and the energy has to find a way down here.
One thing I would add to, and a topic that I got strangely obsessed with at the end of last year, is offshore transmission is also a really interesting prospect, that you can avoid a lot of the troubles that you have when you're building on land by moving things into the ocean. And in particular for offshore wind, there are a lot of benefits in terms of reliability and maybe even cost by literally connecting wind farms off the coast and bringing power directly where they need to go. So you could get lines going straight into Boston as opposed to going to the Cape and then somehow needing to get upshore. And so the New England states have a process where they're really looking into this right now to see what is feasible, what's not, what federal dollars can they tap. And the Biden administration is really into this. They are, I believe, about a year and a half into a 2-year study where they're really analyzing the feasibility of some sort of networked offshore transmission system for the Atlantic coast. So I think it's exciting.
And this is not some crazy new technology, right, Miriam? This already exists, like it's viable?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have been, some European countries have offshore transmission. I mean, they're transmission lines, right? That's like how islands get their power in a lot of ways. But yeah, some of you might be familiar with the Google backbone idea that came about a long time ago. That was back when offshore wind in Massachusetts had its first big promise that fizzled, but this talk of connecting everything offshore, and it would enable Massachusetts to buy wind from a project in the New York Bight. It would just open things up in a lot of really interesting ways. It also has a lot of ecological benefits too. You're just using literally less line. You're digging up less of the ocean to get more power exactly where you need it. So it's expensive, and it involves a lot of coordination, which is probably going to be its downfall if there is a downfall. But yeah, a lot of upfront work.
So before we move on here, I do want to go back to Sabrina, your point, because I think that speaks to a larger issue about local opposition to clean energy projects. And shout out to the Carbon Copy that did a fantastic episode this week about this phenomenon that's happening all over the country. But I'm really curious, where else do you see that playing out here in New England?
Where do we not see it playing out? I mean, I think we see it in every major project that comes up. There is some form of that. For instance, there's a lawsuit against Vineyard Wind, which is not going to really stop anything.
There are 4.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this new kind of, especially among conservatives, this new messaging of the whales versus wind, and this opposition. And do we really care about the whales, or do we just not want clean energy? That's not mine to litigate in this moment, but there's that. There's I mean, I hear in my inbox, you guys probably do too, all the time from people who are like, I am a conservationist and I care deeply about climate change, but they are trying to build a solar field in my community.
Yeah, this is not the right place for this here, And
right. What about the cranberry bogs? What about the forests that I care about? You can go all around Massachusetts and find a thing that people want to protect, and that is completely legitimate. We are facing a biological diversity crisis in addition to a climate crisis, and there are smart ways to figure this out. You have to protect corridors for wildlife, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, you also have to build a ton of clean energy for us to not cook the planet. And so the NIMBYism is, rampant.
I would just add, this is a huge source of frustration for the people who are working on building these clean energy projects. They talk about it all the time. It's what comes up. They talk about the siting. They talk about how there's this sort of momentum and wind to their backs from the federal government, from the state and regional governments, saying, here's all this money, go build us the stuff we need to decarbonize. And then they get to these local siting boards and people say, is that solar panel going to explode? Or, this is blocking my view of the X. And it can be really challenging to deal with. They need those approvals, they need those permissions, they need to win those people over. And the lobbying doesn't work the same way that it does if you're lobbying, Congress or even a state house. It's different, it's very personal, it takes a lot of time. And so it's definitely a challenge to watch.
For sure, and all of this is going to start playing out in a very local level. This is going to start playing out in like committee meetings and like very local town halls. So that's going to be fascinating to follow. Something else that comes up a lot, both on proponents and maybe some of the opponents to clean energy, is jobs. Touting jobs, job creation is huge on the pro side, but when we think about something like offshore wind, you mentioned that before, we have no supply chain here. So a lot of the jobs that are going to be created, at least in the short term, are going to be in construction, not necessarily the lasting long-term job creation. So what are you seeing there, and where are we seeing some opposition, for instance, for local fisheries that are hugely important in the region as well?
I think, if I can take that first, I think I'm going to separate that into two questions. On the jobs front, I think that everyone agrees that renewable energy has a tremendous power to spur a ton of jobs. And I think if we're not seeing it right now, we will start seeing it very soon, is that there are not enough people. I mean, if you've ever tried to like call an electrician so you can install a heat pump or do something, like there are not enough people doing this. And I know that this is a priority of the Healy administration. I think it was a priority of the Baker administration as well. And so it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. I think a lot of people in power, both federally and at the state, have a very strong commitment to these being good jobs. They want these to be union jobs. They want these to be well-paying jobs. And so whether or not that can happen will be something very interesting to watch. And I can answer the fisheries question, or if someone else wants to take that or add on to the jobs thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would just agree with the jobs thing in that we're already seeing a boom in jobs, and there is this anticipated kind of much bigger boom as some of the job training programs get underway. You know, there's some interesting stuff happening in the city of Boston that the Wu administration has implemented to really hit the intersection of job development and clean energy. And then on the fisheries thing, you know, that's a tough one. Like, I'm from Maine, coastal Maine. I grew up there. You know, we had our lobsters were delivered in a paint bucket that would get dropped at the end of our driveway from people that we knew who were lobster fishermen. Like, it is a part of your life. There are these incredible growing pains that are happening right now. That are hard. You know, the Boston Globe, not myself, colleagues of mine at the Boston Globe, I think did a really beautiful job of looking at some of those challenges in a series last year that they did. You know, that there is that reality. There is another reality too, though, around like the growth of aquaculture and a lot of like the kind of blue carbon movement to use the ocean in really creative ways that is, I think, bringing new industries to life, and especially in a place like New England, where we don't have a fossil fuel industry to lose, there is a lot to gain in the birth of those new industries.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to the fishing comment too? So about 2 years ago, Ben Storo of E&E, who's a good friend of all of ours, he and I did a series about offshore wind, and we did a big story about fishing. And our takeaway from that was that, yes, offshore wind is going to impact fishermen, but it will not impact fishermen in an equal way. It's going to as this feels like the story you hear over and over again, right? But it is going most likely to disproportionately impact small-time fishermen, the people who tend to fish near the shore, who don't have as much flexibility in where they go, who can't just, you know, get a bigger boat and go out here. But a lot of the big-time fishermen are probably gonna be okay. We're not gonna build wind farms in George's Bank. And so that's sad, and that's really, you know, it's coming on top of an industry that's already struggling for other economic reasons. And I think one thing that I come back to a lot in climate reporting, and I would imagine you guys do too, is that there is no perfect solution to anything. Everything involves trade-offs, and the stories are often in how we manage those trade-offs and how we help people find a new job, or, you know, how we manage those trade-offs, I guess is how I would summarize that.
anything to add? So maybe staying on the jobs, we mentioned before that environmental justice is a big priority, as is a diverse workforce. I'm curious how you are seeing that playing out. How are training programs, Mass CEC, we have folks in the audience here, how are they being intentional about making sure that these jobs and the training for those jobs goes to the people that need them the most?
I mean, there's a lot of outreach being done. What's interesting too, also, Ben and I in our series did one of the stories, obviously looked at jobs, right? And it's the union pipeline that you need to address. It's not necessarily the training program, which is interesting, right? You need to, and the unions, to their credit, I think some of them, probably better than others, are out there trying to get young people to come in and work in an apprenticeship program, because you can train an electrician to go up on a wind turbine, but you need an electrician first. And so I think that's an interesting thing.
There are some cool training programs that are being launched, though. Like, for instance, a year-ish ago, when Mayor Wu was announcing an effort to start electrifying school buses, she made the announcement at one of the local technical high schools, where they were also announcing the creation of a program to train EV electricians there, and it was like what they call it, a train the trainers program. So there was this entire kind of infrastructure built around teaching kids skills that would result in being employed in really, coveted positions, but also using it they were going to be repairing, like working on some of the electric vehicles that the city has, and also the buses, right? And so it was a situation where you could have students who were riding some of the first electric school buses to their schools, where they were then learning to work on those engines, repairing the engines of other electric vehicles for the city of Boston that they were in the process of switching over to, and then leaving school, graduating, and getting a job as a mechanic working on electric vehicles, right? So it was like this very clear model for addressing a problem right now on the ground, and then building a nice future for these kids in the process.
And real quick, I think I would be remiss if I did not mention that a lot of local universities also have really amazing training programs. So Bristol University, the Mass Maritime Academy, they are going hard on training offshore wind workers and probably solar workers too. So there is momentum happening, I think,
We're like, in so many things, I feel like we were like on the precipice of this thing just like totally blowing up, right? And it definitely applies to the
but
jobs.
if you know a young person, you should probably tell them to go become an electrician. That's
Definitely.
still probably the right thing.
And this is also another area where, again, it's something that the project developers, the companies behind these big offshore wind projects spend a lot of time thinking about. They have people not only working on building the sort of active workforce of today, but working on long-term strategy. And it's in their best interest to be building a really robust pipeline of workers, and one that's strong and stable and with good paying jobs.
Absolutely. Another big area for the states is building decarbonization. Building decarbonization has been in the news a lot lately. If you missed it, Canary Media did a big series about this, which I recommend everyone go check out on the site. But more locally, the Healy administration has a goal of installing 1 million heat pumps by 2030, and decarbonizing 500,000 homes by 2030. In states that have very old buildings, that is a huge challenge. So how are states doing in building decarbonization? And who wants to take that first?
I mean, I can. Here's a quiz. Anybody know how many heat pumps were installed in Massachusetts last year through the Mass Save program? I'll just cut to the chase. No, not zero. No, there were a lot. It was
200,000. No, too ambitious.
Let's just take an order of magnitude.
20,000.
Boom! It's about 22,000, which was a 2.5 times increase over the year before. Okay, so it was a huge growth in the amount of heat pumps that were installed in the state of Massachusetts. It was a small fraction of what needs to be installed in the state of Massachusetts. So there are incredible programs that have been offered through this reform of the Mass Save Energy Efficiency Program. I wish I could qualify for it in Maine. I cannot. You can save a ton of money by installing heat pumps now. And then you add the IRA on top of that, the federal legislation from the Biden administration, and things start to become more affordable and within grasp for a larger number of people, right? That has not been the case until now. And so, again, let's talk about things that are on the cusp. We are on the cusp of this big growth, except you can't do it if you don't have the people who do the job, right? So you have to have all these pieces lined up together to actually be able to take advantage of it. You know, in climate, we talk about the hockey stick a lot. Mostly we talk about it in terms of how global warming is going through the roof with fossil fuel emissions. But it also works for the growth of clean tech and the adoption and this idea that you kind of limp along for a while until you hit these inflection points. And I think that we're at the cusp of one now.
Yeah, I haven't covered it as closely from a statewide perspective, but anecdotally in my personal life, I feel like I sense a shift. You know, people will ask me about it. They know I cover energy, and I have to tell them I don't really know. Go ask somebody else. But the amount of people talking about, should I install heat pumps? Should I, move that way? And sort of, is it cost efficient? Just asking the question and looking around, I feel like has exploded in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. I think heat pumps are having a huge moment.
It's so hot right now.
Yeah. Which is awesome. But something else that's having a bit of a moment is building codes and gas bans. So as part of the law that passed last year, there's a pilot program that allows 10 municipalities within the state to enact gas bans for states that burn a lot of gas. How is that going? I know that was one of the sticking points for Governor Baker that almost derailed the entire bill. Where are we at now with that program? Who wants to start?
Do you want to?
Sure. So we are right now in the process of selecting the 10 cities that will get to participate. There is preference going to municipalities that had expressed an interest in this prior to the passing of the climate bill, and I think 7 of them still want to be, some number of that, some have dropped out. So there's room for others to apply. We know the city of Boston intends to apply, which would be huge. And, if you sort of look at the legislation, what they're hoping to do with this pilot program is get out some of the growing pains early on. And they want a diverse set of cities to participate. They don't just want a bunch of wealthy suburbs outside of Boston to do it. You want practice doing this in a big city like Boston. You want practice doing this in a more rural area. So it'll be very interesting to see what towns get selected. And I think that selection happens at the end of this year, early next year.
So the selection from the initial 10 that applied, that is going to be happening through the fall on a rolling basis. So my understanding is that, come like September, October, November, we might start hearing the first couple communities. After they've gone through those first 10, then they go back into the bucket to see, all right, of those other ones who have applied, who do we, who's going to get the spot? And those announcements will come, I think, in March of 2024. So like the earliest you would know, for instance, that if Boston is selected, I think would be March of 2024, at least according to the statute.
I think what's so interesting to me about this program, which I've really enjoyed writing about and following, is that there are all these cities and towns in Massachusetts that have progressive leadership who really want to take action on climate, and this is an area where they have a lot of power and authority and control over generally. So it's an opportunity for them to sort of leverage that and to, within the borders of their town, to set this restriction and to measure it and to contribute to sort of what the state's working on. And I think it sort of empowers and energizes cities and towns in a way that they've been sort of really trying to, and they've been asking to for a while now.
Yeah, it's funny, like if you think about how long Brookline was trying to get going on this, it's like there was like this rubber band just like pulling back and pulling back and pulling back, right? Now all these other communities, as Brookline's being told, no, you can't do it, they're all kind of coming on, and then suddenly it's like ping, and you've got all these communities that want to be part of the ban, but that at the same time are adopting this specialized building code, which does not ban fossil fuels, but what it does is it makes it very unattractive to build with fossil fuels for new buildings. So you have all these additional things that you have to do. You have to pre-wire the building so that it can be fully electrified later. You have to add solar panels. You have to reach a certain higher building standard that costs more for a reason. And in doing that, the idea is to disincentivize fossil fuels without, falling short of an all-out ban. We saw the city of Boston just yesterday fully adopting that. And we've seen several cities around the state that have done the same, and others that have indicated that they are hoping to do it as well. So like between those two things, between the specialized building code and the ban, the amount of movement happening at this very moment, it's pretty kind of head spinning.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have gotten really down like a rabbit hole of climate, and you're like, also you got really into building codes too, like who knew? But one more thing on the pilot program that I think is interesting is, you know, it was a compromise, and I think a lot of very climate conscious people were disappointed that that was the outcome, because the year prior, you talk to the architects of the 2021 climate law, and they had intended to write into legislation the ability for towns to require all electric or ban fossil fuels. And that was not the way that the Baker administration interpreted that statute. So in the 2022 law, they sort of went back to course correct, and there was more sticking points. And yes, it almost did derail the climate law, and so the compromise was a pilot program. And while that will be slower in reducing emissions probably than allowing towns to do it, I do think there is a silver lining to that, which is that like we're going to collect a ton of data, because in order to be a participant in this, you need to be collecting data about electric bills, you need to be collecting data about building costs. Like we are really going to have some good data about what it means to go all electric. And hopefully that means that as that extends to more towns in the future, it becomes more affordable and we avoid certain pitfalls. So I do think it is, I mean, as far as I know, Massachusetts is the only state that has a pilot program. Other states have allowed bans outright, but I do think that's a really interesting thing to watch. Like, this is a place where we really desperately need more housing, and we need more affordable housing. And so, you know, there were two good causes in tension, which is, are you going to make housing harder to build and more expensive, or are you going to help the climate? And those two things shouldn't have to be in tension. And so hopefully what will come from this pilot program is the knowledge we need to make sure that they're not going forward.
So let's talk about affordable housing for a moment, because there is a huge equity component when it comes to building decarbonization, both because of the health impacts of burning fossil fuels where we live, but also because while it has upfront costs, it also, electrifying buildings has the potential to save folks money in the long term. What is the state or other states in New England, what are they doing to make sure or aid in affordable housing being able to participate in these decarbonization strategies or lower income housing?
What is the state of Massachusetts doing?
Yeah.
I just talked a lot. If you want to take it, I can take it too.
I can start. I mean, I think there is what the state plans to do and what the state says it's going to do, and then there's like what the state is doing, and those are not the same thing. In the sense that I think there's still a really big donut hole. I think there are a lot of people who are being left out. You know, I think that there's a lot of great language and intention around reaching out into environmental justice communities and making sure they're able to access mass save rebates and be able to participate, especially because a lot of these mass save rebates are, you know, some of them are like 100% covered if you're low income, right? But if you're not offering that in the language and with contractors in the communities who speak the language, then you might as well offer nothing. And there are a lot of places where there still is this huge gap. And again, we've heard a lot of things about efforts to close that gap, but I have not heard much from folks on the ground about actually seeing that work being done. And so, you know, look, in addition to hiring a new climate chief, Maura Healey also created an environmental justice position and hired a very beloved environmental justice champion in Maria Belén Power to fill that role. So there's a lot of optimism around some of the work and the opportunity for change she just started, so I'm not going to judge her on what has and hasn't happened yet. But so the hope is that will bring more people along, but that's a lot of pressure to put on one person, I would say.
Yeah, I think too, unless I've been talking a lot, so cut me off. But another problem when it comes to building decarbonization and affordability is that it is very different if you own your home and if you rent. If you own your home, you have many more incentives to decarbonize than a landlord does, right? If you are someone who owns a couple of triple deckers in East Boston or South Boston, you don't have any incentive to do this because people are paying you crazy rent anyways, and they're paying their own utility bills. So I'm very curious to see what this administration is going to do to try to bring landlords around, and whether that means you need some sort of like mandate to say that all buildings need to be X, Y, and Z by X, Y, and Z date. I think that people don't want to touch that, but there are those who say maybe that is what we need. I don't know. But yeah, there is sort of like a market mismatch there a little bit.
Well, an alternative to a mandate is to come up with incentives that are too good to pass up, offers they can't refuse.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, you've got stuff like Birdo 2.0 in Boston, right? That is addressing, it provides a model for addressing existing buildings by saying that this is that buildings must, buildings over a certain size must decarbonize or reduce their emissions by X amount at different increments over time, right? It puts them on a schedule to accomplish that. We haven't really heard proposals to do that for existing buildings. I think that there is this real fear of switching over to the stick mode of climate rule. Like we're all about the carrots right now. At a certain point, there is this, people will admit quietly that we will switch to sticks, but we're not there yet. At a certain point, we will be, and I think that you point out in particular is where one of the biggest sticks will have to be is for landlords, because right now there's
no incentive.
There's none. Yeah.
So speaking of sticks, where are the gas utilities in all of this, or where else is there pushback to talk about building decarbonization or going further with potential bans for new construction, for example?
Well, the gas utilities certainly are not thrilled with the prospect of homes that are no longer hooked up to natural gas. But I think from some of the building sector folks, you see pushback too. I think some of it might just be this is something new, this is something scary, untested. Others, are very concerned about the affordability of building decarbonization. I think you see a variety of pushback, of types of pushback.
Yeah, and one thing that the utilities have sort of pivoted to is talking a lot about hydrogen. Their sort of main incentive is that they want to keep using the pipes and distribution systems that they've been developing for decades or however long. And so that's one thing that they sort of push for is can we, sort of use green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, whatever you want to call it. We could debate those terms for like 3 hours if we wanted to, instead of sort of other options that would force them to sort of completely get off the pipe system that they already use. So that's sort of where they come from, and you understand, why they would have that financial sort of position.
Yeah, I think there's been this fundamental mismatch between the vision that gets laid out in state climate plans that leans really heavily on electrification, and then when you talk with the utilities and look at the plans that they're submitting to the Department of Public Utilities and their own internal plans, which clearly say, the message that's coming out is, look, we're a gas utility. We are also an electric utility, and we are absolutely on board with this energy transition. We believe that in order to do this in the best way, that transition looks like this. People have heat pumps and gas. And over time, that gas transitions from fossil methane gas to gas that is made from renewable gas and a blend of green hydrogen, without really looking at the same things that advocates will tell you is problematic about those things, like there isn't very much of it and it's super expensive, requires a lot of energy, it emits harmful toxins into your house, or will eat up your appliances. There are myriad reasons why they will say these things are really bad ideas, and yet it's like a foregone thing. Like, well, of course we're going to have the pipes, we're going to need them, because electrification is not sufficient to actually heat your home on a cold day in Massachusetts, which the facts don't agree with that. But I think, you know, what we have seen and what all of us have reported on quite a bit is this kind of pushing, shoving between the advocates and between the state government and between the utilities that's playing out at the Department of Utilities through various proceedings to really say, what is this going to look like? How are we going to get where we need to go? Because there is not yet right now there is all this business incentive for the gas utilities to maintain their infrastructure and
to build new infrastructure.
And to build new infrastructure, because that's how they make money. But there's not a whole lot, it's like the state has just allowed that to be the way that this is. And so without really fundamentally rethinking the role that utilities play in the state, it's hard to see it going any other way, because right now we say, it's your job, tell us. Yeah. How does this work? What is the path forward?
Yeah, and going back to your idea of the stick, I mean, I've had that same thought, and I've wondered, when does it transition from a sort of push and pull and a nudge and whatever to sort of a more sort of outright, you know, conflict? Because you certainly could see it heading that way as the utilities remain stubbornly pretty tied to their business model, and as more and more sort of progressive governments come in the state of Massachusetts and say, we need to change.
Absolutely. That leaves us with our last big bucket to tackle, which is transportation. Transportation emissions make up the largest amount of emissions in the state, and there's a ton to do on that front as well, both incentivizing EVs for private folks to drive, but also the MBTA and electrifying public transport. So where are we at when it comes to transportation electrification?
Well, the MBTA is going great, so I don't think you have anything to worry about there. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
No notes. Do you want to go?
No, go for it. Go for it.
I'm talking too much. Someone else.
I mean, we're behind. Like, we could, we could
it's
say
not
that.
going great. Yeah, I mean, look, I wish I could remember numbers off the top of my head better than I can, because we pulled all these numbers to look at what kind of EV registrations do we have compared to what the goals are. Let's suffice it to say, it's not good. Again, similar to heat pumps, there is this hope that we are in this moment of change. We've got bigger state rebates. We've got rebates for used vehicles for the first time ever. We've got enhanced rebates for, wait, did that end up happening?
It's coming.
It's coming.
It will be announced sometime this month.
It is, okay. So this amorphous additional rebate that will happen eventually for lower income folks, and then we've got the federal incentives. And we've got all these new models that allegedly someday the supply chain will figure itself out, so these models will actually be able to be purchased instead of just sitting on a waiting list for 2 to 5 years or however long it is these days. So there is this moment. We are not yet in it. We are like creeping up to it.
I'd say the same goes with the charging infrastructure, where it's so close, and like I really think if we were having, I agree completely with what you said, and if we were having this conversation in 3 years, I think the EV landscape would be very, very different. That said, I think EVs are still out of reach, even used EVs, for a lot of people, and so that is going to be something that will need to be tackled. Also, like, the solution can't be that everyone has an EV.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I don't know how many of you drove here, but traffic is horrible. Like, the last thing we want is more cars on the road. But also, just from an equity standpoint and from a practicality standpoint, we need to invest in alternative modes of transportation. And I think the Healy administration is committed to doing that, and we'll see what the new GM of the T brings to that. But you know, it's hard to have a city, and it's hard to talk about decarbonizing the transportation sector when you have a public transportation system that is very limited and barely works when you need it to.
It is noteworthy, though, like how little we talk about mode switching. Like it is just like
no one wants to talk about it.
Nobody wants to talk about it. And you know, I have talked with like government folks who are like, yeah, we're psyched, we are really beefing up the chat about mode switching, and then you look at the thing that they're referring to, and it's like there's like 2 sentences, and right, and whereas before I guess there were none, but there's so, like, when you look at where there are really big gaps that have to get made up, like introducing and normalizing that concept that it can't be 1-to-1 car like gas car to EV, I think it's a big one.
Well, not to be pessimistic about it, but even the T's process of electrification has been really messy. You know, the commuter rail electrification is something I've written about. There's been all these debates about what technology to use the catenary wires, to use electric locomotives. There's like, they don't have enough money for it, so they're waiting on the legislature, and it's just like, nothing is easy on that front, but it's obviously vitally important.
Yeah, they're still buying some diesel hybrid buses that will run in EJ neighborhoods. There's a lot.
So I have some numbers to bring into this.
Okay. Great.
The MBTA is supposed to stop purchasing fossil fuel buses at the end of 2030. Does anyone want to take a guess at how many battery electric buses the T had as of last year?
As of last year.
Was it in the single or the double digits?
Single.
Oh, no.
5.
Nice.
5 battery electric buses. So, I mean, that's a long way to go, not to mention the charging infrastructure for these massive amount of public buses. On the EV front, the state says we need 200,000 electric vehicles by 2025. How many do we have right now?
I literally wrote this story.
You did write the story. We have 51,000 EVs. And the public charging stations are a huge issue too, right? We don't have enough, and the ones that we do have are concentrated, unsurprisingly, in wealthier parts of the city. And so that equity component is also going to have to be really important in how those are distributed to make them accessible. But I think that does bring up a conflict. I think the little laugh we got out of the room is because we know how hard it is to get around already. I'm on the Silver Line and I'm waiting 15 to 25 minutes for, like, if I miss the bus, right? So that's already like you are very late. So how do you see that balance playing out of like these very ambitious goals, while at the same time we need reliability of public transportation so that people don't then go back to driving cars or taking Ubers or other things?
I mean, it's sad to say, but it really is hard to think about the decarbonization of the public transit system right now. Like, it's really not even serving its basic function. So I don't know how you can even, there are people at the T who are trying, and they should be trying to have those conversations, but I'm not even sure how you bring that to the fore at the moment, honestly.
I mean, some of it I think comes down to like redesigning streets too. Like, I could ride my bike to WBUR, but like it scares me, and so I don't, right? But I could, and I think that you know, kudos to all you bikers and on Com Ave and everyone there, but you know, there are ways also to do mode shifting that are less like you must get rid of your EV and start riding a bike, but just making it more acceptable and making it safer.
Yeah.
But it is, I mean, I think we are at the point now where I think it is a valid question to ask. Is the T going to be one of the things that stands in the way of Massachusetts reaching its climate goals? Because how are you, if you rely on the MBTA, how are you supposed to trust that when you're making decisions about how you're going to get around? You know.
And I think some of it too, your colleague Taylor did a fantastic story that I would totally encourage everyone to go read about the delays in electrifying the MBTA. And one of the issues that she talked about was just overall supply chain issues, that even with the best of intentions, you can't get the things that you need to actually build the charging stations, and you can't get the battery buses that you need. So I mean, that's obviously not a Massachusetts specific problem, but there are bigger forces at play as well.
I was going to go back to EVs for just a second, because I do think that charging infrastructure is a bottleneck that people don't necessarily give as much credit to as they should. It's sort of, it goes a little bit under the radar, and I think that there are buckets and buckets of federal money coming in to every state in the country for charging infrastructure. Some states are going to do well to use that money to build out an equitable and effective network, and others aren't, so we'll have to see if Massachusetts is one of those.
So being mindful of time and that we don't want to end on this bleak note, before we open it up to questions, I would love to hear from each of you. What is a story, a policy, or a local initiative that you are super excited about that you are currently following or want to follow more closely? Sam?
Can I have a second to think and see if one of them has something
Yeah,
ready?
I know, I do too. I mean, we mostly, like, I feel like I mostly spend my time in, like, the depressing space. So it's, like,
Absolutely.
middle of our, like, if
Absolutely.
you want to tell me, like, what's bummed me out today, I could, like, list several things. So, optimism. Less familiar face. I think that there's interesting efforts that I've been seeing recently around designing school curriculums to integrate climate in a bigger way. You know, I think, not to be a downer, that falls against the backdrop of horrific things that are happening in public schools in more conservative states, right? And this incredible conservative backlash to the things that children are allowed to read. However, in a place like Massachusetts, in New England, I think there is some like inspiring work done to kind of bring climate change into everyone's lives at an earlier age and kind of get everyone involved.
All right, I'm going to take a cop out by really pandering to the home crowd here and say that the innovation, climate and energy innovation in Boston and Massachusetts and New England is really incredible. I've had a chance to tour Greentown a couple times and meet some of the companies who are working here and all over the region, and it's like we are a hotbed of that kind of stuff. And it shows, and people are moving here to work on those kind of things. You know, we're really central to it, and I think it's something the Healy administration is very aware of and looking to capitalize on. And people bring it up all the time, and I haven't really covered climate tech as closely, but it's hard to avoid when you're in Boston. So,
I'll stick with the optimism too. I am very interested to see what happens with this little body that nobody knows about that is incredibly important called the Energy Facilities Siting Board. So this is the state body that essentially approves all big projects, and they have a tremendous amount of power, but it is not a particularly transparent organization, and it does not really allow for much public participation. And that has come to a head several times in several projects over the last few years. And I think that you have had advocates calling for EFSB reform for years, and I think that the Healy administration is listening. And so I will be very curious to see, I know there's a few different iterations of it in legislation right now, so very curious to see what comes out of that. But I think that, I do believe that the siting board will become more people-focused, and that it will be required to pay more attention to the climate implications of the decisions it makes as well.
I would also add, that reminded me of something that's pretty cool that just happened, which is for many years, the Cape Light Compact, which provides electricity to parts of the Cape, has been trying to put forward this really progressive program and get it approved by the DPU, which would take some low and mid-income households and fully kind of take them off the grid, do a lot of weatherization, fully electrify them, provide them with solar panels, and it has a lot of benefits both to these individuals and also to the grid, right? It took years. The DPU found like 500 different ways to say this is not allowed under our rules, sorry, except that's now changed. And thanks in part to the legislation that passed last year, that was just recently approved. And so now that program is going to be able to take off, and I think it's a really interesting kind of case study in equity. In like how can we provide like wraparound electrification services to specific targeted households to try to kind of address this in a really holistic way, and I think it's really exciting to see what that's going to look like.
Awesome. Thank you for indulging my last question. That was great. We'd love to take some questions. I think we have a little bit of time from the audience.
Okay. So you talk about where there's hope, because offshore wind is rising in price and there are all kinds of roadblocks to siting wind and solar. How do we pay for it all? I would like to give you some hope and ask you to do some stories on nuclear power and all the advantages that get overlooked, and to change the public's opinion of that. So what would you all think of that?
Nuclear power in New England is a really interesting subject. I think do we have one nuclear plant left? Two. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the economics are just not very healthy for the companies who are running those plants. It's a really challenging space for them. I mean, nuclear has certainly been valuable to the grid. It will continue to be valuable to the grid. I just think that, it's a technology question, and there's been all this promise about small modular reactors or various other types of new nuclear technology that has been supposed to be sort of on the cusp for 10, 20 years at this point. Maybe we're actually there. The 10-year out joke, I think, is, we're always 10 years out. But yeah, I mean, I think innovation could help with that. From a political and policy standpoint, there are certainly coalitions that want to keep nuclear alive and continue to have nuclear as an important part of the grid, but I don't really see us building a full-size, nuclear plant in New England potentially ever again.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that there's sort of, like, when you're thinking about nuclear, there's kind of two conversations happening. There's one, which is, what should we do about the plants that exist right now? And I think the general consensus among climate folks seems to be keep the ones that are online as long as you can safely, because they provide quite a bit of power. And then there's the question about new nuclear plants. And I think Sam is right. The economics of like another big Pilgrim or another big like Vermont Yankee, like that's not going to happen. But yes, there is promise in the small modular. It just, again, right, the joke is like it's 10 years away. I think also there's a perception problem. And you can look no further than what's happening right now over the debate at Pilgrim with the radioactive wastewater. Nuclear scares people, and I think that that is something that you need to consider whenever you're thinking about that as a potential solution too.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. So I think Massachusetts has some of the highest electricity rates in the nation. And with the electrification push that you've been talking about, we're just going to add a whole lot more demand. At what point does this not, prices are going to go up, presumably, if there is more demand? Maybe you could talk about like where you see prices going, and is there ever a future where in Massachusetts we have prices that are more in line with all the other states?
Yeah, I mean, in general, prices are really high this winter in particular, let's say, because the price of natural gas is really high. And that still to this day is more than 50% of our electricity in New England. And so one of the promises of renewable energy, and I am not an economist, so I will defer to what people are telling me on this, is that these, as people will say, the cost of wind and solar don't fluctuate with what Vladimir Putin does today, right? These are inherently less volatile commodities, and the idea is that in theory they should bring price stability.
But you asked like when.
Yeah, when.
There are these benchmarks that we're kind of on the precipice of, Vineyard Wind, for instance, being fully operational next year, 2028 for if the other two big offshore wind projects are able to happen. I think it's 2025 that the main transmission line, if it comes through. Each one of these moments is a very big moment in terms of switching over a large amount of the power so that there is less reliance on natural gas. And yeah, every minute that happens is one that, saves you money.
This also gives me another chance to talk about a point of optimism, so we can go there. But there's an increasing trend among utilities and state regulators about looking at creative rate design. And what that means is sort of changing the way that customers are charged for electricity. So one great example, which probably many of you have heard about, is time of use rates. That's essentially charging a different amount depending on when you're using electricity. It's often referred to sort of with EV charging. So for example, you're charging your car at night when fewer people are using electricity, and you might get a discount for that. And there's other rate design ideas as well, variable rates versus sort of straight rates is one way to put it. And so I think, so the point is that with the technology that you're talking about that's leading to electrification, there's also a lot of new opportunities for demand response and for systems that are more responsive and more flexible to allow prices to come down.
And I think maybe we have time for one last question. Where is...
Hi, Alistair Pym from NECEC, the North East Clean Energy Council. You talked about nuclear, but there's another type of nuclear, there's fusion. What do you think of fusion as a solution for the future?
Oh wait, that's the one that's 10 years off, not regular.
Right, that was, I read that one article that came out recently about the breakthrough. I didn't understand much of the science. I enjoyed the debate on Twitter and elsewhere around it, and that's frankly the extent of my knowledge about fusion. It's, because it's not sort of used in any real way, and it's hard for us to find time to focus on, honestly, for me at least as a reporter.
I think it's really friggin' cool. I mean, right? Like, super exciting. It feels a little bit like space aged, and I've also heard arguments that say, like, we need to throw everything we've got at all sorts of promising technology like nuclear fusion, but also not get distracted by shiny things, because we have a lot of technology that we know works, and so doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on that while also allowing this research to go on and investment to go on in that corner too is really the way that we can ensure that we've got like ample coverage, because there's no moment where 30 years from now we'll have nuclear fusion and we'll be like, God, I wish we didn't have so much offshore wind. Like, that's the worst, like there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's no bad side. So I mean, I hopefully the cool shiny thing pans out and we're good to go.
And ditto to both of those comments.
Yeah, I would just encourage you to go out to Fort Devens, where there's going to be something happening in the next 5 years. It's not 10 years away, so check it out.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I am a reader, a listener, and honestly a huge fan of the three of you. So thank you for being here with us today. And thank you all for coming out and sticking around. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.